Good, I guess I should say good midday to everybody who's in the UK, or good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. And welcome to our webinar today on how modern sales approaches can help you to drive value from learning technology. This was a speech that I gave first at Learning Technologies last week. And we thought, because there are a number of people who wanted to attend that but weren't able to, we thought we would offer the option to hear it again today and to interact with me around this topic. Now, for those of you who don't know Imparta, we are a global company that are experts in sales and service excellence. But we're also learning technologists, and this goes right back to 1994, I think it was, when I built the first dialogue-based learning simulation when I was at McKinsey. And for me, a lot of the kind of real innovations in life come at the intersection of different disciplines. And over the years, I've seen the way that our studies into how people sell and our studies into how people learn have basically converged into a view that selling and learning are very much two sides of the same coin. And if you think about it, that does make sense, because salespeople are generally taking customers around a decision process that ends up with them committing to a purchase and then using that skill later, or the product later. And in learning, it's the same thing. People go through a change process, and it's our job as L&D experts or sales training experts or whatever we're doing to try and build performance, to try and help people through that change journey. So today's presentation is about that kind of intersection, if you like, of sales, learning, and the way that we understand selling, and the way that training can work in almost any context, actually. I will speak, I guess, primarily from a sales training and a service training point of view, because that's the area I know best. But these general approaches can work irrespective of the content that you're teaching. So let me begin just by sharing a little bit of research that we did with trainingindustry.com, which showed that 71% of the 200 odd companies that we spoke to thought that cost savings were a benefit of e-learning. And this was, again, in the context of sales e-learning, but not dissimilar to the kind of statistics you would see across the board. 47% of salespeople preferred e-learning as a way of building their skills, but only 30% of the companies felt that e-learning was a very effective way of building skills in that population. And I think that kind of underpins one of the issues with a lot of learning technology, that it's often very attractive, it's good for the buyer, but it doesn't necessarily help to really generally build skills in the target population. It's better for knowledge transfer, not so good for building skills. And that's why, you know, one needs to think about application and practice, but also the change process that these lessons, if you like, are built into. So let me begin the analysis of that problem, if you like, by looking at how customers buy. And the way, as I mentioned earlier, that most people think about customer buying these days is through some kind of buying journey, or what we call the buying cycle. And that typically begins with need, which is where the customer starts to become aware that the status quo is no longer good enough, and they need to either change the way they do things or adopt some kind of new product or service to help them achieve their objectives. Then they start to identify what potential solutions there might be for their need and choose which of those solutions is going to be the best fit for their organization. Now, quite often people think that's kind of the end of the story. You've decided on which supplier or product or service is going to be the right one. But actually, there's another stage that we call worry, which is where people start to worry about what might go wrong. And they do that at 4 levels. Strategically, am I getting into a relationship with the right type of organization? Tactically, is this going to have the impact and deliver the benefits at the cost that have been promised? Politically, what happens if this goes wrong to my support in the organization? And even individually, so am I going to create more stress and frustration for myself by going down this route? So the worry stage is actually really important in sales and also in learning. And then finally, we get into a commit phase, which is kind of a staged process, by the end of which people have, in a sales context, they've made a decision to buy a product and they've signed a contract, and the negotiation process happens in that commit stage. Then we get into adoption, where somebody implements the product or service and starts to use it. And then in many, many organizations, especially these days, if you have some kind of recurring contract, that needs to be renewed and the opportunity to expand the relationship explored. So that's kind of the buying journey that people go through. And if I put that into the flip side, how not to sell, if you know that's what's going on inside the mind of the customer, there are a number of things to avoid. The first of which is to start by saying, look at this fantastic product, because that is not stimulating a need. And if somebody doesn't have a need, just doing a kind of product dump is not going to create that need for you. In the choose phase, what not to do is to say, here's what's in it for you, here's the value that you're going to create, because that ship has sailed. The value discussion, do I need this? Is it going to create value for me? Is in the need stage. In the choose stage, it's really about, okay, I know I need to do something. Which of these alternatives offer the best bundle of value in terms of the costs and the benefits and the features of each product or service? So just saying, here's what's in it for you, which is a phrase that you'll hear often in L&D, doesn't work in the choose phase. In the worry phase, how not to sell is to say, can we sign yet? Here's a discount if you sign now, because that reinforces the concern. That reinforces the view that something might not be delivered, and therefore, in effect, a discount is compensation for that. In the commit stage, what you shouldn't do, again, is to go, no, really, here's a discount if you sign now, because again, that's not a great way to create momentum to get people over the line. There's usually residual concerns or contractual issues, or even a need to reframe back to the beginning and show people again why they were thinking of doing this in the first place. In adopt, what we shouldn't do is go, good luck, here's the manual, see you in a couple of years. Clearly, and in the renew and expand phase, we should also not go, well, you haven't seen us for a few years, but I'm back to talk about renewal. So that's how not to sell. And let me now flip this across into the learning space. So how organizations learn, and this cycle actually applies equally to organizations, but also to individuals as they think about how they're going to change their skills and improve their performance. So in the need phase, we become aware of the need to change or to learn. In the choose phase, we choose which new approaches and which learning tools work for the organization or indeed for the individual. We worry about what might not work well with the new approach, either the new skills or the new learning tools. And then we commit to the new behaviors that will hopefully change our performance. In the adopt stage, we use the skills and we go beyond use to become advocates for whatever new approach, whether it be leadership or sales or negotiation, that we're training people to use. And then finally, in the renew and expand stage, we're continually reflecting on how it's going and renewing our learning. So it's although it's shown as a single stage, that sort of process of reflecting and renewing is going on all the time. So that's how organizations learn. And just as we did a kind of a quick summary of how not to sell, I'm going to just talk through here how not to train. So in the need stage, what you don't want to do, and again, this is in the context of either a particular training solution or learning technology, you don't want to go, look at this product, look at this fantastic learning technology, it's going to change your life, because that doesn't relate to people's own personal objectives or indeed the company's objectives. So how can we get them to realize that they need to change their behavior or change the way they learn? And that's not the way to do it. In the choose phase, again, going, what's in it for me is not the right way to get people to sort of select which of different alternative approaches works best for them. What's in it for me for one relative to the other, maybe, but not overall. In the worry stage, don't go, it's coming, here's an incentive to use it. You know, it's not just about one-way communications and incentives in the worry stage, there's more to it than that. And in the commit stage, again, it's not just about going, here it is, and expect people to use it. In adopt, it's not about just reminding people to go, don't forget to use it. And in the renew expand stage, it's definitely not just about we've updated it. So how not to train based on an understanding of the decision process that individuals and organizations go through when they're thinking about a training solution. And I hope you can see and find this as interesting as I do, that the way that people and organizations think about adopting new skills is really, really similar to the way that people make purchases, which is kind of consistent when you think about it. And actually coaching, when you take it to that level as well, follows very much the same process. You can take the GROW model, goal, reality, options, and wrap up or will, depending on your version of it, and map that to this buying cycle as well. So these are the things that we would suggest you do. Instead of saying, look at this fantastic learning technology, actually go, what needs to change? And to start asking questions, instead of just saying, look at this, ask about what needs to change in our organization. Instead of saying, here's what's in it for you, ask, what's the right approach for you of these different alternatives? In the worry stage, instead of offering incentives and saying it's coming and using communications, ask what concerns people have and work with them to alleviate those concerns. In the commit stage, rather than saying, here it is, we actually ask, will you commit? Will you commit to using this? In the adopt stage, rather than saying, don't forget to use it, we ask, what are you trying to achieve? And here's how the learning solution or the sales approach or whatever it is can help you to do that. And then finally, in the learn stage or the renew expand stage, it's not about updating, it's about understanding what's working, what's not, and asking people what else you need. Now you'll notice the difference between the what not to do statements and the kind of the pink colored what to do. And one of the key things, apart from the substance of what each one is that we're asking questions rather than making statements. And anybody who knows about sales knows that questioning is a far more powerful approach to building momentum and getting commitment in the sale process than making statements. And the same is true in driving change through learning. And there's a number of reasons for that. And one of them is about the power of questions in a behavioral economics or a psychological point of view. So imagine that I'm actually making a statement to somebody. On the left-hand side here, the tell statement. So I'm basically telling somebody that this will help you to perform better, you should use it. What kind of reaction is that creating in the mind of the person who's hearing that statement? Well, there's something that you may have heard of called confirmation bias, which means that we tend to ignore things that we disagree with and hear things that we do agree with. So if somebody doesn't feel that they need to perform better, then they're probably not going to really hear what's being said to them. The confirmation bias will kick in and they'll basically go, I disagree, I'm fine, I don't need to change. So just telling somebody that this will help them to perform better is actually a pretty bad way of getting them to think about that. And if you follow up and basically go, no, I don't think you got it the first time, let me explain again, it has a second effect, which is it sounds like you're not listening to them and that you're oriented around your agenda, which will itself reduce trust between you and the learner. So just making statements as somebody trying to drive change in a team is actually quite a damaging thing to do. Let me contrast that with asking questions. So if I ask a question like, what do you think the impact would be if you don't improve your win rate? Then that has a very different effect. Instead of confirmation bias, we trigger a different effect called instinctive elaboration, which means when you ask somebody a question, generally that question will sort of hijack the brain and it becomes quite difficult for somebody not to think about the answer to the question. So they're kind of going, okay, that's a good question, let me think about that. And rather than spending the time thinking about how they're going to rebut what you've just said, they actually are considering it. And so asking a question is a much better way of getting inside the head of somebody you're trying to work with. It has a second effect, which is you get useful information because they will answer that question generally. And the way they answer it tells you an awful lot about if you're trying to make the right change in the organization. And there's a third effect, which is lots of studies have shown that when people share their opinions, that actually increases trust, opinions and feelings as well. So asking questions, it drives instinctive elaboration. It gets your message across much better. It gives you more information than you would have had if you made a statement. And it asks you, it builds trust by asking people about their opinions and feelings. So if you take one thing away from this and you're thinking about how to drive a change process, think about your learners as customers and don't just tell them stuff, but ask them questions to engage them in the change process that you want them to go through, irrespective of the platform or the content. So I talked about a couple of things there that I want to just expand on. And those of you who know Imparter well know that we've been doing a lot of research over the last few years into what we call the 3D advantage. And the 3D advantage basically looks at the way organizations sell and the three critical dimensions that drive effectiveness in the sale process. And in the context of this webinar, we're talking about how those three dimensions apply in more general terms to learning and development. And the three dimensions are insight, influence, and trust. It's one of those things that it sounds easy, but once you start thinking about it, these three dimensions really are prevalent across all of sales and indeed all of management. And the way they play out in L&D is as follows. So insight is about creating value within the learning community through disruptive insights into their challenges. And again, this is framed as sales challenges, but it could be anything. It could be leadership challenges or technology or anything at all, really. And the learning solutions that might help. So you're creating value by bringing insight to the table as an expert, not stating things, but asking questions to drive value for the learner. Then you have influence. And influence is about driving leadership and changes through the team through the ethical use of behavioral science and decision strategy. And I stress ethical use because these tools, like, just simple ones like instinctive elaboration or confirmation bias or some of the other cognitive heuristics that we're all susceptible to, they're very powerful and you do need to use them with integrity. Now, if you have insight and influence, there's one other thing that you need, and that's trust, because trust creates the ability to have a proper dialogue. It engages people with you, whether selling or trying to drive learning. So trust is about gaining access through, and I draw on the work of David Maister and others in the book, The Trusted Advisor, which is a great book about trust. And David Maister and his team came up with a set of descriptions for what makes trust. And his equation went credibility, so do you know what you're talking about? Do you know your stuff? Reliability, essentially, do you do what you say you'll do? He called it intimacy. I prefer business intimacy, but do you understand what the other person is trying to achieve? And do you relate to them as an individual as well as a subject to whatever you're doing? And all of that is divided by self-orientation, or if you like, multiplied by customer centricity. So are we thinking about the agenda of the person we're working with instead of just relying on our own agenda? So if you have those three things, insight, influence, and trust, it's critical that you do for being able to sell, but also for being able to drive change through learning and development. And let me think about how those three dimensions now play out around the kind of change process. So here what we've done is taken that change cycle that I mentioned earlier: need, choose, worry, commit, adopt, and renew, expand. And we're now mapping onto that the stages that L&D, and I've just seen a question from Nazmullah Giddis. L&D, sorry, I should have explained, that's learning and development. But it could be sales enablement or any other part of the organization that's helping to drive learning. So the actions that we need to take when the organization is defining its need, we need to help them to define it. When they're choosing the right solution, we need to help design that solution. When they're worrying, we need to engage with them and help them to alleviate any risks that they feel. In the commit stage, that's kind of where the training happens, but it's not just training to give skill, it's training to get commitment to use the skill. We're driving adoption, and then we're learning with the organization and helping them to renew and expand the approaches that they're applying. And again, the three dimensions of insight, influence, and trust play out because they help to underpin each of those stages. So I'm just going to kind of walk through what those stages involve, one at a time, fairly quickly. In the define stage, it's very important to begin, and this is kind of fairly obvious, but to begin with what it is you're trying to achieve. So think about the need in the buying cycle. So if you're talking to a learning community, what is it that they need to achieve? And again, it's about asking them and getting their involvement in that process of definition. On the left-hand side, you can see some of the classic KPIs or metrics that one would look at in sales applied to the buying cycle. So in the need stage, you're looking at conversion rate, cycle time, average deal size. In the choose phase, you're looking at win rate versus competition. In commit, it's kind of negotiating contract length and gross margin through price and so on. So understanding what the business metrics are we're trying to shift, then in the middle here, mapping that to the skills. And we use a card deck as a way of identifying kind of which skills apply to which part of the buying cycle. And there's a lot. I mean, there's 80 cards or more in that deck. Some of them to do with leadership and management, some to do with kind of core execution of sales and negotiation and customer experience, and some of them more advanced. And by the way, if you're interested in getting hold of a copy of the card deck, please drop either me or Rachel, who's our the person who's leading the webinar for us, and we'll get that to you. We'll put the email up later on. And once you've identified which skills you need, then it's about mapping different roles onto the levels of skills that people need. So not everybody needs the same level of skill. If you have, a junior frontline manager, they might need different skill sets to somebody who is the leader of a function. Somebody who's inside sales, different skills to somebody who's in the field negotiating multi-million-dollar contracts. So setting target roles per skill by role, target levels by role, avoids investing too much in skills that people don't need, and also at that point it's a good time to agree what measurement approach you're going to use to actually track those skills. With a lot of learning tech as well these days, especially learning experience platforms, you're able to almost tailor that kind of definition of where we're trying to get to by individual, not just by role. And if you can do that, obviously that's very powerful. So that's the define stage. I just want to talk about one other bit of behavioral economics that's very useful in the define stage. We're trying to get people to shift their understanding and believe that they need to make a change and adopt a new set of skills. And what we find is that people act to avoid a loss far more than they do to achieve a gain. So here's a typical curve that shows the value perceived by an individual, depending on whether on the right hand side they're gaining something or on the left hand side they're losing something. And basically the pain from not acting or pain from losing something is, in the research, about 2 to 4 times greater than the perceived value of a gain. Now what that means is people act to avoid a loss. And so rather than saying, if you build these skills, it will give you this outcome, a better way to frame that is to ask questions, going back to the questions around, if you don't build these skills, what will happen? So use loss aversion in that definition stage in order to actually drive genuine change in the people that you're trying to affect. The design stage is a very interesting one. So this is where we kind of are trying to select the right methodology and the right learning approach in order to kind of create the basic framework for the shift that's going to happen. And that does need to be a co-creation process between the different functions who are involved and also any third parties like us. And it's important to design the change process, not just the content. So what's the change process going to look like? What are the learner journeys? How are we going to interact and get two-way conversations going? And how are we going to measure it? Then there's contextualization. And we find that it's useful to think about that kind of contextualization in the context of how do you create new materials for training an organization. And the pyramid on the left is roughly the proportion of work that we find we have to do. So about 15% of the time we're creating new content for somebody, or embedding their systems and processes into existing content in a way that's a fairly major process. About 25% of the time we're just combining modules in a way that says, okay, this role, you need this version of that module and this one, but we're not having to create additional stuff. So that makes it very, very efficient, but also allows something to be genuinely tailored to each group. And then at the bottom end is the contextualization. That's the bulk of what we do with customers. And that's all about saying there's a skill, and the skill is not really different depending on the industry you're in. But when you're practicing that skill, it's not unhelpful to have that set in your context. So we contextualize the exercises, the role plays, the kind of anecdotes, if any, that are used. Those things are used and set in the client's context. So you don't have to design everything from scratch, I guess is the key point here. You can use off-the-shelf content, but modularize it, combine it in the way that works for that team, and contextualize it. And you've kind of got the impact of a fully custom course for a really small fraction of the cost. Engage, as I mentioned, needs to be a two-way process. Knowledge advisors found that 40% of learning failures were the result of learners not being actively engaged in the initiative. So in our experience, actually, a good 30% is to do with what happens after the training as well. So the training is, as counterintuitive as it sounds, a relatively small part of the change process in terms of where the failures lie. So you've got to engage people in the initiative. That can involve videos and games and meetings and websites, but it has to have a back channel. There has to be a way to be able to ask questions through that and then get the answers back. In terms of the way we engage people, I want to draw on another piece of behavioral economics and psychology from somebody who I have a great deal of time for, the Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman. Now, you may have read a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, and Daniel Kahneman came up with the idea of there are two systems of thinking that operate all the time within our brains. And the first one is on the left-hand side there. If I show you that picture, you know pretty much instantly what's going on there, and you know what's happening and what's going to happen next. It's somebody who's angry or frustrated, and they're probably about to yell. On the right-hand side, though, if I showed you this equation, unless you're much better at mental arithmetic than I am, you probably don't immediately know what the answer is. You know the answer is not 3, and you know it's not 1,000,000, but you'd actually have to sit down and work it out. And that's an example of system 1 and system 2 thinking. So fast thinking, or system 1, is on the left. It's quick, it's intuitive, you don't really have to think about it. And on the right-hand side is slow thinking, which is more kind of measured. It requires actual logical thought and processing in the cortex. Now, the brain is designed to be efficient. If we tried to do everything in our lives using slow thinking, it would take a great deal of time, and it would take a long time to process, and we wouldn't react quickly enough to things that happen. So much of what happens in our brains is actually run on system 1 thinking, and the brain calls on system 2 as needed to support system 1. And it's system 1 where a lot of the kind of the heuristics and the built-in cognitive biases happen, because we're making shortcuts basically a lot of the time. So when you're engaging users, if you look at what's in a lot of training, and especially what's in a lot of communication, a lot of it is very system 2. It's very kind of measured, logical. Here's what we need to do. Here's what's in it for you, all the rest of it. And so it's worth actually thinking about how to drive more system 1 type of thinking through that process, and engage people with fun things. You know, that's why videos work, interactive exercises, games, something that's completely different that just engages the more intuitive, reacting parts of the brain. Training. Training is obviously key, but for me, there's one essential component, and that on the left-hand side is something called David Kolb's experiential learning model. We don't learn skills by being taught them. So, you know, this webinar will give you information, but unless I could get you to practice, it's not going to build the skill. That's something that you'll need to take away and do later on. And Kolb expressed it this way: we have an experience, we reflect on it, and then we do what he called abstract conceptualization. So we start to build a mental model of how the world works and what the theory is, if you like, of how to do this particular task better. And then we experiment, and it's going around that cycle the whole time that drives skill building. If you think about most e-learning, it actually starts with the theory. So here's the theory that you need to know. And then if you're lucky, there's kind of a quiz and some kind of reflection afterwards, but very little in terms of actual in-place experimentation. So, you know, you might start at abstract conceptualization and move around to reflection, but we're not going the right way around the cycle, and we're often not doing enough of the experience and the experimentation. So especially in the classroom where you can do this, but also e-learning using things like simulations, you need to create experiential learning that follows that Kolb learning cycle. I wanted to give you an example of some content, because methodology is important. And I see a lot in Learning Tech last week, there was a lot of content that was, you know, looked nice, felt good, but didn't have the substance that you need in order to perform better. So I wanted to give you an example of a skill that most people have been involved with at some point, and just to show the difference between okay practice and best practice, and why it's so important to have the right methodology when you're training. And again, I'm using sales as an example, but this applies across the board. So pitching for a piece of work is something that almost every organization does, unless you're purely B2C. And most pitches follow a process that looks a bit like this. There's an introduction. The company gives their credentials. They kind of, if you're lucky, they'll talk about the customer's needs and the solution and what that solution might look like. Then there's a bit of kind of why us, you know, what makes us different, why should you choose us, and talk about the team and so on. We'll talk about price maybe towards the end, because nobody likes talking about price. And then some kind of a recap at the end, and often a statement that's all very well-meaning, saying, we'd love to work with you. We're excited about this project. I'm going to have plenty of time for questions at the end, by the way, but just maybe you could just type into the chat window. Does that kind of feel relatively consistent with the way your organization, unless you're from Imparter, the way your organization would pitch? Totally consistent. Thank you, Lorna and Michelle. Good. Okay. So let's take another look at that and think of it this way. Think about the reaction that the people listening to that pitch have. And I'm going to plot it on this kind of axis up the left-hand side. So when the introductions happen, there's a nice buzz in the room, everybody's friendly, and people are like, oh, I'm getting on really well with this customer, but everybody does. And it's a bit like, I always say, the judges at the beginning of The Voice, when the new act comes on and they've got their backs turned to the stage, and it's like, oh, could this be the one? So there's a kind of a buzz in the room at the beginning. And then if a company goes into talking about, you know, here's my company, let me talk about, you know, we've got 18 offices, we've been around for 30 years, we do this, we do that, we've won all these awards. The people listening are like, I actually don't know if I care yet, because I don't know if you're the right people. So this is not interesting. So you get a dip there. Then the reaction gets better as the pitching company talks about the customer's needs. That's a good thing to do. And then the solution is important, but often it goes on too long, and it's too system two in its approach. So it's very kind of structured and dry, I guess is the way of putting it. And sometimes it's too long and too confusing. So you end up kind of dipping into the negative reaction as the solution drags on a bit. If you're lucky, there'll be something fun, like a video or maybe a demo that kind of piques the reaction. And then you get down into difficult questions. Now, think about what's happening in a pitch. The customer is sitting there with basically a spreadsheet that they want to fill out. that has on it all of the decision criteria and a column for each of the companies they're seeing. And they're scoring you against those criteria. So unless you have a strategy for how to deal with the criteria where you might not be as good as some of the other people, maybe price, or maybe they're an incumbent relationship with the company, or whatever it is, when they ask about those, which they will, because they're on the sheet of paper they have to fill out, you're not going to have a great answer. And that means it's going to be a difficult part of the presentation, and it will create a negative peak. You start talking about then why us and the team, and that's positive, creates a small buzz when you talk about your differentiation. But then quite often we're straight into talking about price. And the thing about price is it has to be framed right. You have to talk about price in the context of value, and that's something that people often try to ignore, price, in a pitch, or they don't adequately frame it in the right way. And so it creates a negative kind of dip in reaction. And then the recap of the solution and the nice statement about we'd like to work with you is good. It's not amazing. It's not like a super wow way to finish the presentation, but it's okay. So that's the reaction. And the question is, what's the overall impact that that kind of profile of reaction has on the people who are watching it? And for the answer to that, we turn again to Daniel Kahneman, who basically said that what people remember is not the constructive tension is something that Evan is saying. Yes, so constructive tension is actually an important part of this, and I agree, Evan, that's something I'll touch on in a second. So what gets remembered is not the average reaction, but it's actually the peak and the end. So he called it the peak end rule. And in this case, because the biggest peaks are negative, what gets remembered is the negative peaks and the end, which is kind of so-so. So even though that's a very typical pitch, and it's not terrible, I mean, you look at that, it's like, that's okay. But actually, what's remembered is generally quite a negative reaction, even though it seemed to be going okay at the time. And that's because the end was moderately okay, but not brilliant. And the peaks, the biggest peaks, were negative when we talked about criteria that you hadn't prepared for and price. So how can we change that? How can we fix that? And the answer is, and we call this the perfect pitch. So the first thing is to have a clear structure, and it's a 4-act structure that we use that you can apply to almost any film you've seen. And the way we think about it is the first act is the need, the second act is solution, the third act is fit with your needs, and the fourth act is value. We begin with introductions. Then we go straight on to, we don't talk about the company, we go on to talking about the customer's objectives and bringing insight to those objectives and to their decision criteria, so that we're actually adding value to their thinking, helping them to see their problems. Remember the 3 dimensions, this is insight, bringing insight to their thinking around what it is they're trying to do through the pitch process. And then we use contrast bias, which is the fact that when things are contrasted directly together, the differences become even more significant, to create a future vision for where we're going from and where we're going to. So this is the status quo, and here's, against different criteria, where we think this solution can get you to. So we're using contrast bias to create a system 1 peak, an intuitive peak in the thinking. I'm just going to have a look at, there's a question from Jeremy Topple here. The peak is often a subjective take on what's heard, and therefore will vary across the audience. How do you coalesce the audience to the same positive peak? Yeah, I agree, Jeremy. I think there is a difference in view about what's good across an audience. It's clearly made up of individuals. That said, I would argue that there are certain consistent things that will create a negative dip, and certain consistent things, as we're talking about here, that will create a positive peak for most people in the room. So that kind of system 1 little flash there is one of them. When you're into the solution, you can create peaks by giving people a sense of ownership without wishing to kind of throw too many concepts There's something called the endowment effect that means that people, when they feel like they own something, they actually place more value on it. There's a famous experiment done with owning a chocolate bar and wanting to buy it or sell it. And essentially what you can do is by giving people a demo or maybe a trial usage or a balance on a subscription or something like that in a pitch, you can actually make people feel like they actually own this and therefore create create more value around it for them. And you can see, by the way, why I say earlier that the ethics of this is really important, because some of these tools can be used inappropriately, and you need to not do that because it will destroy trust. Question coming in from Tony Shepherd: has the time reaction pitch worked better in particular sectors? I'd say not, Tony. It works pretty well across a wide range of sectors, from utilities to manufacturing to high tech to finance. Not a big difference in the way people think about making a purchase decision. So then we get into talking about decision criteria, and if we plan for talking about what we call the value killers, the things that potentially you're weaker on the alternatives, then we can minimize the negative peak there. We talk about costs and benefits and options, again, framing price in the right way, and using other things like social proof to demonstrate that there's a valid reason behind this pricing. We again limit that negative peak that was created by pricing, and finish strongly with something like a recap of the initial vision and the fit with your criteria. And remember, I talked about loss aversion earlier. So here's why doing this will stop you making a loss that you would otherwise have made. So there's, and obviously there's a lot more detail there. I'm not trying to teach you how to pitch here, but just to illustrate the importance of a scientifically research-based methodology when you're training. All of those things create far more of a positive peak in the kind of the contrast bias point at the top. And so all of the peaks are positive and the end is much better. So that leads you to finish on a much stronger note than you would have done with the classic pitch. So the point of that, again, is really just to say, when you're training, going back to the kind of the training bit, as you're getting people to commit, not only do you need to get people in the classroom or through the e-learning to build skills and to commit to using those skills mentally as well as physically with you, but you also need to be training the right things, because there's a big difference between an okay set of methodologies and a very well designed one. Moving on to an example would be great for start to end. Yeah, and I'd be happy to, Evan, I'd be happy to do that. I guess I'm kind of segueing into the pitch thing just to give an example. And I'd be happy to kind of work through a worked example of that another time with you, or yeah, I'll think about if we can build that into the next time we run this. So adoption clearly is very important, and it's a bit like a golf swing or a tennis swing. If you don't follow through, you're not going to achieve the results that you would like. So coaching is critical, and managers are critical in any training, and that's because we're trying to drive people through that adoption process. Coaching itself is a skill that needs to be coached. You can't just do fire and forget on coaching. It needs coaching. We find that coach-to-coach services are very powerful. And then some kind of stimulus, some kind of way of keeping people thinking about the issues. We have a thing called e-cards, and there are other solutions on the market that just fire out reminders to keep the skill top of mind in the mind of the learner. And then things that help people in their job. So it's not just about doing a course, it's about how do I actually solve this work problem. So troubleshooters, playbooks that help people to apply a set of skills in a particular context, like a product or service. And again, manager-led buzz sessions to drive kind of stimulus of the content. And then assessments and measurement, application tools. Jeremy says you've got a good initial reaction to the e-cards. That's good. I'm pleased to hear it, Jeremy. By the way, nice to see you. So yeah, driving adoption using a wide range of techniques is super important. And again, a lot of learning tech is put out there without necessarily thinking through how we're actually going to get people to adopt the skills that it encompasses. And then finally, we get into the learn phase, and there are 4 levels that a gentleman called Kirkpatrick, that I'm sure many of you know about, came up with: reaction, understanding, application, and business impact. The key thing for me is that, measuring is a way of driving behavior change to start with, but also it's an opportunity to learn. So it's not just what the metric is, it's what you do with it that matters. So at level 1 reaction, obviously you can have quite a quick cycle time of reaction. If a course or a particular module on e-learning doesn't go down well, you can fix that immediately. If somebody's not understanding something, then you can use reinforcement or managers, or even just sending out a kind of update to kind of fine tune the understanding. If it's a question of application, then it's about coaching. And if it's a question about business impact, then it's about understanding, okay, let's correlate the different skills we have with the different types of impact and understand where the biggest driver is and where we're falling down, why it's not achieving the impact it should. So learn in this context is not the learner learning. This is us as L&D or sales enablement learning and trying to drive the performance impact. So let me just finish off before we run to some other questions. Let me just finish off by talking about how good do people need to be. And I think that one of the things I love about learning, and especially I have to say about sales learning, is that there are very non-linear returns to the effort that you put in and to the skill and effort that the staff put in. Using sales as an example, there are always things that salespeople are competing against. It might be the status quo, doing nothing. It might be another competitor. It might be coronavirus. It might be all sorts of things. So how good do people need to be? Well, if you're not good enough to beat the alternatives, you're on the left-hand side of this graph and you're going to be losing much of the time. If you are better, then you're going to be on the right-hand side of the graph and you kind of pass that inflection point and suddenly the returns are really substantial. So Dave Brailsford, the GB cycling coach, termed this the aggregation of marginal gains. It's about doing lots and lots of things a little bit better to drive genuine impact in results. So I think that if we're going to do learning, it's worth thinking about the change process, because getting the change process right helps you to do better than the alternative, which is for people to stay with the skills that they had before. And we all know people who go through training and then fall back to old approaches. So, if you're on the left-hand side of this curve as an L&D specialist or a manager trying to drive change in your team, you're not winning. You get to the right-hand side of the curve, you are winning. So it's worth putting the time and energy in to understand what the change process should look like, and using the right tools in order to drive that kind of reaction. So there we have it, the 3D advantage for L&D. Insight, creating value through insights into what the team needs, and this works for managers too, by the way. Driving kind of changes through influence and building trust by showing that this is for their benefit, not for yours. We have 3 white papers, which I would be happy for Rachel to send out to you guys if you are okay with that. And we might do that over the coming kind of week or two. The first one talks about protecting revenue against uncertainty. We are at a time of almost unprecedented economic policy uncertainty. And what this paper does is analyze the key metrics that drive new and recurring revenue for a business and how you can pull those levers to optimize the result and protect yourself as much as possible. The second white paper talks about the 3D advantage in a sale context. And the third is the subject of this webinar, which is about the 3D advantage change process. So we'll be happy to send those out. Again, if you'd like a copy of the deck of cards, please feel free to ask as well. So with that said, let me throw the floor open to any questions that you might have. Rachel, perhaps I can ask you to coordinate this last little section. Feel free, if anybody has any questions, to just pop them into the message box as well, the chat box. I'm just going to scroll back and see if I've missed any. Okay, I had to I was made the
Hello.
host, so Rachel was on mute. My apologies, Rachel. Sorry.
That's okay. Hi all. I know we had a couple of questions come through. One was, what kind of impact do you think a proper change process can have?
So going back to the slide that shows the curve, let me just pop backwards. This one here. The training, doing it well, can have a pretty substantial impact. So I've seen, let's take win rate as an example. I've seen win rates go up by, a factor of 2 or 3, and that kind of impact can make a big difference. So we've seen impacts of full academies we've done that are in the hundreds of millions of pounds or euros, and again, it's kind of helping people to get just good enough that they pass the threshold and the results start to change quite significantly. Let me just pick up 1 or 2 of the other questions here. So Rich Hudson is asking, can I go over the similarity of selling and training briefly? So I guess just to summarize that again, when you're selling to somebody, modern sales is all about understanding the process and the thinking they're going through in the buying cycle, where they go from realizing they have a need through to choosing the right solution and committing to it and then adopting it. And the same is true in training. So if you just drop a product on somebody, they won't want it. In training, if you drop training on somebody, it's not going to stick. You need to take them through that process in exactly the same way that you do in sales in order to be responsive to where they are in the journey. So if somebody's in the worry stage and you're trying to convince them that this is the best of 3 alternative approaches, that's not going to work. So you need to be cognizant of where somebody is in their journey in order to be able to support them and to achieve the goals you're trying to achieve. That's a very short answer, Rich, but I hope that's okay. So Jeremy is asking, given macro events limiting our mobility, what learning technologies can help improve our practice of virtual coaching? That's a great question, Jeremy. I assume you're referring to coronavirus. And that is something that we have taken very seriously at Imparter. And I think that there's a couple of things going on here. So one is clearly there is a risk that mobility, and it's already happening in Asia Pac, but there is a risk that mobility will be limited. And for people involved in training, that means that we have to be ready to run virtual sessions as well as face-to-face sessions, which is something that thankfully, this kind of Zoom technology allows you to do. So you can have breakout rooms, you can do kind of coaching within the breakout rooms and so on. And thanks, by the way, for all of the comments on white papers. I'm sure Rachel will be capturing those. So yeah, I think with coronavirus, one needs to be ready to shift to virtual delivery. The key thing for me is, though, this is not a time to be leaving, especially salespeople, to their own devices to figure this out. You need to change the content a little bit as well, and maybe include some content on how to sell in this kind of environment. So not only, thank you very much, Steve, take care. Not only are we thinking about how to engage with customers and how to ask questions over a virtual in a virtual environment, which is a slightly different skill. So we have a module on selling in a virtual environment, which is quite useful at this kind of time. But also the objectives that you're selling against and the changes in those objectives that are happening quite now, they are going to shift, and those changes are quite rapid. So suddenly the decision criteria that a customer used 3 months ago might be very different now, because they're all about supply chain continuity and not price. So it's very important to think about not only the way we train people in response to coronavirus, but also the way we equip them to deal with selling in that kind of virtual environment, and in the way that customer changes are going to affect the way they need to sell. So that's something that we're looking at really closely right now, and I'd be, Jeremy, happy to have that conversation with you. Okay, well, I think we're pretty much at the end of the session. I'm very grateful to all of you for your participation and some great questions. We will send out the white papers, and if you If you want the card deck, that's great. We'll send that to you as well. Really appreciate your time. I wish these things were all video so I could see you all, but I hope to meet you again in person. My email address is down there, richard.barkey@imparter.com. As you probably can tell, I live and breathe this stuff, and I find it absolutely fascinating. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Evan. And so I'm always happy to talk about sales, learning, negotiation, and the application of behavioral science. So I will be looking forward to talking with some of you about that in the future. Thank you very much indeed. And I wish you a very, very successful, pleasant, and calm rest of your day. Thank you.